My name is Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years.
Setting up our house in Dessie, a newly built one, and we were the first occupants. We were so glad the Lord provided it. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, dining, living room, and a bathroom. The walls were a bit crooked, but the chandelier in the dining room made it look like home. The next afternoon, the truck arrived, and we were anxious to get unloaded and settled in. Not only was our furniture on the truck, but many cases of canned goods bought from the Brown Shop in Addis. We were also able to buy a freezer from a military couple, which would be put to good use. Well, as you recall, in Addis, I alternated between strep throat and kidney infection. Before we could get our boxes unpacked and settled, I became ill with strep throat and ended up in the hospital getting IVs. We were blessed to have a Seventh-day Adventist hospital in Dessie, which was the same as we had in Addis. As the Lord would have it, my doctor in Addis was filling in at the hospital in Dessie, so he knew me quite well. I was in the hospital for several days and all the time thinking of so much that had to be done at home. I was extremely weak coming home, and as I was in the bed, I could hear the conversation going on in the kitchen. My dear husband was great with cleaning, doing laundry, and many other things. However, cooking is not in his wheelhouse. He grew up with 5 older sisters who helped with cooking, while the boys worked on the farm. After high school, he went to college, and after he graduated, we got married, so he never really had a chance to cook or never learned to cook. He and Ron were in the kitchen cooking dinner, soup from a can, and French fries with very small potatoes. Ron was standing over the trash bin, which was almost as tall as he was. He was peeling potatoes. This was the conversation. "Daddy, I peeled 1 potato." "That's good, son. Peel another one." "Daddy, I peeled another one." "That's good, son. Peel another one." I'm not sure how long this conversation went on, but we finally had dinner. I was listening to all of this and laid there between laughing and crying. We were pleased to find out that an American missionary couple lived right across the road from our house. Sadly, on the very day we arrived, they lost their infant baby through a crib death. Fortunately, a doctor who was with their mission was staying with them overnight. This was certainly a blessing to them. In time, we got acquainted with them and became good friends. You remember that I previously talked about homeschooling versus boarding school for Ron. My prayer was that God would intervene and we would not have to send him away to boarding school. A couple of verses that have been such a great help to me over the years are, "Neither know we what to do, but our eyes are upon thee," in 2 Chronicles 20:12. And another one in Isaiah 45:2, "I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight." God definitely made the crooked places straight for us regarding Ron's education. It was now time for him to go into the 1st grade, so we needed an answer. To us, Ron's education was a crooked place and we didn't know what to do, but we kept our eyes on him. We learned soon after we arrived that our neighbor Jan was a teacher, and after the death of their baby, she wanted to teach. She had been asked to teach another MK from one of their stations up north, as well as a little Bulgarian girl from Dessie, whose father was a doctor. So she started a 1st grade class in her home, and Ron joined the other 2 students, making up that 1st grade class. We walked him across the road every day to Miss Jan's house for school. The Lord had given us more than we could ever imagine. However, why should we have been surprised? Ron thrived in school, and an extra bonus was that Jan also taught music, so Ron was her student. Before we left Addis, we had gotten a folding pump organ, so this was his means to practice. Jan had a piano, but every day Ron would come home and pump as hard as his little legs would go in order to play. This began his great love of music, which he enjoys to this day. There's so many little things that we remember which is rather surprising after 53 years, but are still in our memory bank. Dessie was 8,000 feet above sea level, which made the weather perfect. Sitting in the living room in the evening, fire in the fireplace, and ears of corn roasting brings back a smell that is still with us to this day. Ron standing in a chair watching as I made homemade potato chips and wanting to eat them as fast as I could make them. We had a good-sized plot of ground beside our house where we planted a garden. We both had grown up on a farm and were glad to have the opportunity to have fresh vegetables. I remember producing so many green beans that I canned them. Ron quickly made friends with Solomon, our landlord's son. They were together every day after school and played as hard as they could. They gathered frogs and would get so thirsty. We had told Ron to come inside to get water, but as he watched Solomon pick up the water hose and drink from it, he thought he could do the same. The difference was that Solomon had built up an immunity to the water, but Ron had not. We said, "You shouldn't drink the water because you'll get sick." To which he replied, "Solomon drank it, and he's not died yet." Of course, Ron did get sick with amoeba and lived on Jell-O water for quite a while. One night I'd been up with him all night, but when we woke up the next morning, he was laying all curled up on the bathroom mat. We were thankful when that episode was over. We felt very safe living where we were, and we had good neighbors with which we got acquainted. However, many times at night, Ron would say, "Mommy, I can't sleep. The jibs are keeping me awake." Jib is an Ethiopian word for hyenas. They did have a very distinct, eerie sound, but we assured him that he was safe and that they would not come into the house. Dessie had even fewer options for grocery shopping than Addis, and many of the shops were open air. Buying meat was always a challenge, as it was simply hanging on hooks, and you had to point to what you wanted. We bought it by the hunk and had to take it home, cut it up into steaks, roast, and grind the rest for hamburger. It was naturally tough, and the pressure cooker was put to use all the time in order to make it more tender. After some time, we thought a different kind of meat would make a good change. So in spite of the fact that Gene had never gone hunting, a-hunting he went. To our surprise, he came home with about 24 ducks. He and our worker dressed and cleaned them, and I canned them. They did have a strong taste, but barbecue sauce was a lifesaver. A few months later, Paul, our neighbor, came over and wanted to know if Gene wanted to go with him to one of their mission stations 4 hours north of Dessie. Their missionaries had a farm and raised pigs for their own personal use and to sell to anyone who wanted to buy. That was really a delicacy since neither the Orthodox nor the Muslims would eat pork. So off they went and returned home with a whole pig, fortunately minus the tail and the squeal, and thankfully it had been cleaned. They brought it into our house and Paul said, "Now what are you going to do with it?" Well, I grew up on a farm and had watched the butchering, but I had never cut up a hog. But it seemed to me that everyone was looking at me, so here's what I did. I covered our dining room table with plastic and said, "Put her up here." I got out my Betty Crocker cookbook, turned to the back pages, and found the diagram of a pig with all the parts. I began cutting roast, pork chops, and ribs. We did have small pork chops and large meaty ribs, but who would complain about that? Of course, there were bits left over, so I got out the meat grinder and ground it all up and made sausage. I really didn't have a recipe, but guessed at the spices, and boy, was it good. In fact, missionaries traveling loved to stop at our house for dinner, and I served them pork or maybe barbecued duck. While I had the responsibility to feed my family, we had a greater responsibility to give the bread of life to the many hearing and deaf who had no knowledge of God. Isaiah 55:1 says, Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters, and he that hath no money, come ye, buy and eat. Yea, come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. We were finally getting settled, and in our next podcast, we will tell you more about starting classes for the deaf and the problems with obtaining the property for the deaf school. If you want to continue hearing these stories, you can search for To the Regions Beyond podcast and subscribe in your podcast player. You can also find To the Regions Beyond on YouTube and subscribe there.